Hi everyone, it's Jolene from Northern Beaches War and Waste. I don't know if you were anything like me last week and you really felt like the IPCC report came out and it was all doom and gloom and coupled with COVID numbers going up, you just felt like it was just too much to process. What I wanted to do today is get together some fantastic people who are working really well in their field to help educate people about how to decarbonize the planet and how to make changes in really effective and small actionable steps. So I'd like to introduce you to Nigel Howard, who is the principal of Clarity Environment and is also the founder of Northern Beaches Climate Action Network. He's done some amazing work in his capacity as the CTO and VP of the US Green Building Council. And anyone in the Northern Beaches and environment knows Nigel. He's fantastic. And I'd love for Nigel to let us know a little bit about the history of the IPCC report and why the report is so important. Nigel.
Great, thank you very much. What a kind introduction. Yes, so what I wanted to do was introduce the IPCC report with a little bit of history and context, because that helps everybody to understand how to read the report and what to read into it, and also to create a sense of urgency about what we need to do, and an awareness that the IPCC report is really quite conservative in the way it presents information. So first, I want to surprise you a little bit. How do you think the IPCC process started? Do you think it started in China with trying to kill Western democracy and kill Western economies, as you would read by all the denialists? No, it actually started in 1989, when Mrs. Thatcher, the Iron Lady, addressed the United Nations and proposed a pathway to addressing climate change. There's a fabulous YouTube video of her passionate speech to the UN. It was backed up by Ronald Reagan, of all people, and as a result of that, the UN established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And it was established to provide the best possible advice to world leaders on the science of climate change. So when you hear right-wingers saying it's a left-wing hoax, no, it's not. It was started off by quite right-wing politicians. The IPCC reports are extremely conservative. I don't mean politically conservative. What I mean is technically conservative, but with some political moderation as well. They report most likely outcomes rather than worst case precautionary outcomes. And I think this is somewhat of a problem. So when the IPCC says with a high probability, what they really mean is just about certain. So you need to read the IPCC reports and commentary about them, realizing that they are a moderated version of what the scientists have been presented as evidence. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a panel of international experts. It's appointed by governments and supported by teams of expert authors, and thousands of papers get reviewed for every one of the IPCC papers. They cover a whole range of different scientific disciplines. There's paleoclimate, so looking at the long-term geological evidence for climate change, so that you can separate out the bit that's man-caused from the bits that's natural cycles. There's atmospheric physics and chemistry to understand how our emissions affect the different layers of our atmosphere. There's hydrology, understanding how water resources are affected by climate. Climatology, obviously, that's the direct link between climate and the drivers of change. Then there's the marine ecology, how the marine environment is affected by the environment, how it has been affected in our geological past, but also it provides clues to how CO2 emissions have grown. For example, tree rings are used, the width of tree rings are used to measure the rates of growth at different times, going back in time to connect up some of the forecasts. Biology, and also space science, satellite monitoring of the different changes that are happening to the planet. So all of these different branches interact, and what IPCC science is trying to do is find out where this science is all leading in the same direction. It's all reinforcing the same story. So IPCC science is comprehensive, it's authoritative, it's consistent, it's confirmatory across multiple disciplines, but it is conservatively reported and politically moderated. So AR6, the latest report, what is it? Well, AR6 is the sixth IPCC assessment report. So AR is assessment report, and AR5, the last report, was in 2013. So these reports don't come out very often. In the meantime, IPCC have issued 3 special reports on different aspects. The last one was in 2019, and it was on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This report caused a big stir because up till that point, we were still thinking about 2 degrees as the issue that we need to be worried about. But the 1.5 degree report made us realize how significant the difference was between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The other 2 reports, one on land desertification, land degradation, and another report on ocean and cryosphere, those did not have the same kind of level of impact. But the AR6 report, following on from AR5, involved 234 expert authors from 66 countries, 517 contributing authors, reviewing 14,000 papers with 78,007 review comments. So you could call it pretty thorough. It's probably the most thorough endeavor, scientific endeavor, that mankind has ever undertaken, and it has to be. So what did AR5 say? So back in 2013, it described the scenarios and pathways to a safe climate and set a global carbon budget of 120 gigatons of CO2 that the world must not exceed for a 66% chance of staying within 1.5 degrees of warming. That budget has already been blown because it amounted to just 3 years of emissions, and instead of our emissions stabilizing, they are continuing to grow. What AR5 said is that they couldn't determine the extent to which any particular particular disaster was caused by climate change. So this is called attribution science. It's how you can allocate the impacts of climate change to any particular disaster. And this is a big problem because it means it's hard to take legal action against corporations or governments for their failures linked to particular disaster episodes. How have government responded to AR5? Well, I would describe it as in denial, belligerent, ignorance, cynical and sociopathic toward future generations. That sounds harsh, but I think when we're taking extinction of the species right to the very brink, I don't think it is too harsh. I think it's realistic. Instead of agreeing how to fairly apportion this budget for a rational transition to a survivable future, national governments, especially like ours, have gone on a greedy rampage to mine, frack, and take as much of this share as they can before they get closed down by the international community. This is not good. Australia is now the worst, most shameful global pariah internationally, except perhaps for Saudi Arabia. And yes, we feel uncomfortable about that, but we need to recognize that this is the truth. I want to mention a couple of other reports, which are not IPCC reports, but they're commentaries on the science or improvements to the science that IPCC was reporting. The first is by an organization called Breakthrough, and the authors, David Spratt and Tim Dunlop, have gone through the IPCC AR5 forecasts, and instead of looking at them through an average, typical, most likely lens, they've looked at them through a worst case lens. So they've said, let's take the same data, but let's look at the extreme edges, the less likely, the 3 sigma, the 95%, 99% probability of really bad things happening. And their findings are truly scary. According to their work, there is already a 10% chance that we're on course for 6 degrees of warming and extinction of our species, a 10% chance. So they argue that the IPCC is dangerously conservative in its reporting most likely instead of worst case scenarios. So my question is, would you board a plane with a 10% chance of crashing? No, of course not. But that is exactly what we have done as a human race with our attitude to climate change. So the second piece of research I want to mention, which is an addition to IPCC research, well, not really fully in addition, it's emphasizing certain aspects of that research. In 2018, Will Stephan and his colleagues produced a report called the Hothouse Earth Report. And what this report did was collated all the research on the feedback loops, the positive feedback loops that can accelerate climate change and cascade on each other. So they looked at permafrost melting, releasing methane. They looked at ocean methane hydrates being released. They looked at the weakening of land and ocean carbon sinks, increased bacterial activity in the seas, releasing CO2, boreal forest dieback, and reducing snow cover and Arctic sea ice loss, and polar ice sheet loss, because this changes the albedo, the shininess of the planet, whether the planet can reflect radiation back into space or whether it gets absorbed. So if you have less snow, you absorb more heating effect. And these effects can cascade on each other. So ice sheet loss affects the Gulf Stream and how that circulates. And it also affects the El Nino cycles in the Pacific. And that in turn affects all of our weather. And the jet stream, how that's affected, and the effects of forest dieback on water and also the release of CO2. So these all feed on each other. And the danger is that if you trigger certain thresholds, exceed certain thresholds, and they estimated that the threshold was about 2 degrees of warming, then if you get to 2 degrees of warming, then the planet will then kind of go be released unstoppably over these thresholds. These feedback loops will just feed on each other until we get to 4 to 6 degrees of warming, which is almost certainly unsurvivable, and they'll be unstoppable. No one knows how fast the climate would flip once triggered, but this is what we're headed to. So, sorry, Jolene, did you want to?
Nigel, I just wanted to ask you, so is that flipping, and you're not sure how long it lasts between 2 degrees and 6 degrees, is that the point of no return that Greta Thunberg and other the science community more broadly are talking about, that point of 10 years that we have until we go beyond the point of no return, where all of those systems collapse?
She hasn't said that directly, but I think that is what she's referring to. I think she's referring to the Hothouse Earth research because the timescales coincide.
Yes.
Because that's forecast to happen at 2 degrees of warming, which is also forecast to happen around about 2030.
Yes.
So that was the situation with AR5 and the Hothouse Earth research. And now we have AR6. Then we had the IPCC special report on the 1.5 degrees. So at that time, we just had the Paris Accord, and we were talking about policies to limit our warming if we could to 1.5 degrees, but committing to less than 2 degrees of warming. So the special report came out and really said, look, warming of 1 degree has already happened, and we will get to 1.5 degrees by between 2030 and 2052. However, this is IPCC, so everything's conservative. We will actually almost certainly get there by 2030. And they said that they significantly increased the carbon budget, which was already blown from the AR5 report, and said that there was now 420 gigatons of CO2, which was 10 years of emissions for a 66% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of warming. So I'm not sure how you reconcile those two, but I think it may be the science has moved on some, but there was this change.
Either way,
They also,
best case
yeah,
scenario or the worst case scenario, they both seem like really critical points for us to do something as a human race.
absolutely critical, and we are seriously running out of time. This warming, they said, will persist for between centuries and millennia. So this is something, once you go past this point of no return, you are really threatening extinction of our species. And they also highlighted that warming of 2 degrees centigrade is much worse than warming of 1.5 degrees. So that's the context behind the latest report in AR6. So what was I looking for from AR6? Well, I was looking for less conservatism, more precautionary interpretation of the science, less cautious language, a greater sense of urgency, and just how apocalyptic the consequences if we get it wrong. I wanted to see greater consideration of compounding feedback loops and tipping points in the climate models, and I wanted to see a greater ability to attribute disasters to human-caused climate change. This is what I got. The human-caused climate change is unequivocal in AR6, so they're strengthening the language. We will pass 1.5 degrees of warming by 2040. Even if we hit zero now, a lot of change is already locked in, and it will get a lot worse before it gets better. There are drastic reductions in emissions needed this decade, and we need to be at zero by 2050, but it will still take 20 to 30 years to see temperatures stabilize, even if we succeed in doing that. They've also, the models can now better resolve differences between locations in the climate models, especially for drought, which is a critical issue. And they have improved the attribution to specific disasters. This has been a real major improvement in the AR6 report. And what's exciting about this is that now it's much easier to make a legal challenge to corporations and to governments that are not doing the right things, especially by our youth and by all citizens. They found that the Arctic is warming 2 to 4 times faster than the average warming, and they found that sea level rise will rise by 1 meter by 2100 and by 15 meters by 2500. And this will be irreversible over hundreds to thousands of years. Now, have you any idea what 15 meters of sea level rise means for the northern beaches? I'll tell you what it means. We become 7 islands. We are no longer a peninsula with 15 meters of sea level rise. So it's a radical difference. Bear in mind how much how much sea level has risen since industrialization. It's risen 150 millimeters. So this is a huge acceleration of change. We won't notice the sea level rise so much. What we will notice is the storm surge flooding, and this is going to increase dramatically. What has been in the past, the 1 in 100 year flood, is going to happen every single year by 2100. So we can say goodbye to Coleroy and Narrabeen. We're going to have more and hotter heat waves at 2 degrees of warming. We will pass critical thresholds for much of the agriculture, and we will cross thresholds for health, and we will see billions of people threatened with these extreme heat waves. We're going to have longer hot seasons, shorter cool seasons. We're going to have more drought in the tropics, in the subtropics, that's Australia, and more rain at the higher latitudes. We're going to have more intense storms and flooding. We could see the Gulf Stream collapse, and that would collapse the monsoon, and that would have huge impacts, obviously, on everyone, the food baskets of Asia that depend on the monsoon. It would also cause very serious and uncertain impacts on global climate, especially in Western Europe. We're going to have more frequent marine heat waves and ocean acidification. That means the Great Barrier Reef is toast. These tipping points are likely to be irreversible, with forest die-off, the Amazon and the boreal forest, the Antarctic ice sheet destabilizing, and sea level rise. A key emphasis that they make is that we now need to consider methane much more seriously than we have in the past, and build this into our international targets. So that's pretty much covered the report. What does that mean? Oh, sorry, one more thing. This is a Guardian paper which came out a couple of days ago, and it is pretty reinforcing of my point about IPCC science being moderated. It's a group of scientists released part of the draft IPCC report, the next report, because they fear it will be watered down by governments. And they say that greenhouse gas emissions must peak within 4 years in their assessment, not 8, whereas AR6 says 8. They say that the top 10% of emitters globally are the wealthiest 10% and contribute between 36 and 45% of emissions, which is 10 times as much as the poorest 10%. What they're basically saying is that the rich have to fix this problem. And they emphasize we need to stop overheating and cooling our homes. We need to cut air travel. We need to reduce using energy, high energy consuming appliances, and we need to change our diets and stop overeating. So did I mention that the IPCC reports are conservative and politically moderated? Well, these scientists who are contributing IPCC science certainly think so as well. So to conclude, scientists are freaking out. Everything we're doing and experiencing is happening faster than and exceeding the worst case IPCC scenarios. What's happening across, what's been happening globally across Europe into Asia with flooding and extreme bushfires, which we had in 2019, and who knows if it's coming back for us this summer. The drought, the flooding, the crises that are happening internationally with migrants from places like Syria, where they can't support their population. All of this is happening faster than expected. So we are really somewhat deluding ourselves about the progress that we've made. So you need to check out the atmospheric CO2 concentrations Mauna Loa. You cannot see any evidence of change, although people keep telling us we're improving on this and that. There are no evident reductions. In fact, the pace is still increasing in CO2 emissions. So we need some really radical things to happen, and Australia are back of the queue for making the change. Our government doesn't even believe it has a duty of care, and the fossil fuel industries own both major parties. It's really disturbing.
Thank you, Nigel. That is a really sobering view of what exactly is going on in that IPCC report. And I don't know anyone that could absorb what you just said and not feel compelled to do something about it. Now, the people that I speak with in the community are concerned about the environment, but I think that there is a bit of cognitive dissonance about what they can do themselves and what is, I mean, when we look to our leaders, we look to our community leaders, to our local, state and federal leaders, and we think, well, what path are they guiding us towards? What should we be doing? And I feel like when there's been that lack, particularly in the federal area, that we have floundered and not really had that strategic direction. And if you don't have a goal set, then it's very hard to achieve it. So
Sure.
What you said through the process of the IPCC report about the international pressure, how can the rest of the other countries that are more advanced than us put pressure on Australia to comply with some of the net emissions targets?
Yes, well, I think that we've seen some exciting developments with Europe setting up carbon carbon border adjustment. This is a very exciting policy change. And the reason it's so exciting is that it puts an adjustment according to how much carbon is attributable to imports. It puts a sum of money against that carbon, and it penalizes those imports that are coming in that don't have a carbon price from countries like Australia, whereas from countries that have a carbon price, they don't have that penalty. Now, what is really exciting to me about this is how infectious this is. Because now that Europe has put on a carbon border adjustment, the only way an exporting country like Australia exporting to Europe can keep that money in their own economy is to put their own carbon border adjustment and border price on. Yeah. If they don't, their exports are going to be penalized by the price anyway, yes, but the money stays in the importing country's economy. Yes. So it's very compelling for other countries who export to Europe to now put on a carbon price. Now, Australia is not worried about Europe doing that because we export practically nothing to Europe, but Japan does. And we export a lot of stuff to Japan. So watch this space. As soon as Japan puts its border price on, or China, then we're going to be scurrying to figure out what to do.
And isn't that interesting? Even when our government hasn't been stepping up because they don't want to touch that political hot potato of a carbon tax in this country, we've seen other organizations, like big businesses, really investing in decarbonizing. And those, not only those industries, but particularly categories like finance and insurance, because they're really seeing it as, statistically, it's very likely to happen, if not already here. And I think many people in Northern Beaches would have already experienced not being able to get insurance for some of their property, depending on the location. So it's very interesting to hear that trade and other businesses are doing their risk analysis, and they're really understanding that it's critical that we get started on these really big changes. And considering that we're in COVID, we are learning to adapt to change, and we can do the same thing with our carbon emissions as well.
And this is something that everyone can engage with. Everyone can divest their pension. They can divest their super fund. They can make sure that any private investments they have are not going into businesses that are making the problem worse. So we can all do something about this. And divestment has been one of the most powerful change agents internationally, I think.
Absolutely. And that's a wonderful segue to introduce the lovely Anne Charlotte, who is a co-founder of Zero Emissions Sydney North. And Anne Charlotte won an environmental award this year with Northern Beaches Council. Anne Charlotte, can you tell us about the work that Zero Emissions North Sydney is doing locally to decarbonise the Northern Beaches?
Thanks, Jolene, and thanks, Nigel. That certainly, it takes even me a while to process all of that and find my optimism again. But we came together, a group of volunteers in 2019, frustrated by the lack of action on a federal level. And we thought, what can we do ourselves in our communities as individuals? And we kept hearing from friends and other community members that they wanted to do something, but just didn't really know where to start and what to do, what's the most impactful thing. So we did a lot of research to find out where's the biggest bang for our buck, and found the emissions, the areas which produce most of the emissions, which is energy and transport in our area. And there it is, the beautiful pie chart. So this was done for the Northern Beaches Council area, and you can see that over half of our emissions are coming from our use of electricity, because that's, of course, made burning coal and gas. And then another sizable chunk is transport. So at Zero Emissions, we decided to tackle those two areas first, and we've put together easy programs which have a big impact. You can find all the information on our website as well. We do events, usually in real life, but at the moment via Zoom. And we've got a very active social media page. So there's lots of information that we try to get out to our community. But the very best is simply in your own network. As soon as you start doing something, people will see what you're doing, whether that's installing solar or talking about switching your super. That's the way the cluster, the positive cluster of positive action grows.
So could you please tell us what is the most powerful thing that residents of the Northern Beaches can do to decarbonise?
Yeah, so at Zero Emissions, we are focusing on two areas, energy and transport. And for energy, that's actually my very favorite thing, my favorite action is simply switching your power company. This is something that only takes 5 minutes. So it's the lazy person's action. What the background to that is that most of us are with one of the big three power companies, AGL, Origin Energy, or Energy Australia. They still burn predominantly coal and gas to generate our electricity. So have a very high carbon footprint. They're moving away from fossil fuels, but way too slowly. So as a consumer, the most powerful thing you can do is signal that you're not happy and that you're walking away. Now, the question is, where do you go? What's the alternative? And there are luckily now a few power companies that only generate with 100% renewable, whether that's solar, wind, hydro, or biogas. We've done a lot of research at Zero Emissions, and we've partnered with Diamond Energy, which is an Australian power company. You can switch via our website. And as I said, I promise it only takes 5 minutes. Well, it might be a bit like a Jamie Oliver dish, where it says it takes 30 minutes and then it takes an hour. So maybe it takes 10 minutes, but not more. And then they handle everything for you. The beauty of that is that your power bill will also stay more or less the same. Some people actually save money by switching, some people pay a bit more, but overall it doesn't make a lot of difference. And we've just heard from Nigel how dire the need is for urgent action. So even if it does cost a tiny bit more, that's peace of mind for the price of a night out. And if you're really concerned about your energy bill, you can also request a bill comparison from Diamond Energy. You can send in your current bill and they will tell you how much more or less you would pay through the switch. So
Charlotte, sorry, could I ask you a question? So if Zero Emissions Sydney North has a relationship with Diamond Energy, does that help you to be able to understand how to translate people's bills, how to compare bills a lot more easily? Or is there some sort of financial relationship?
Well, what we do is that the bill comparison that happens at Diamond Energy, they do that. And they're actually very frank. If it does cost more to switch to them, they will say that. In terms of the arrangement we have with them, is that for every customer who makes the switch, they pay us a small contribution, and that goes into our community giving fund, which I will talk later about as well. We install free solar for local charities, and it also helps cover the cost of our not-for-profit. We're all volunteers working for Zero Emissions, but we do have some costs like websites and printing material. And so this is where the Diamond Energy contributions come in as well.
It's great. You guys are taking all of the thinking out of it. You are just allowing the bill comparison to take place, and you're making it so easy for people to switch and really make an impact for that percentage of carbon.
Yeah. So with one simple action, you reduce your electricity footprint to zero. And we've just seen that, electricity is about half of the Northern Beaches Council household average carbon emissions. And so if you reduce half of that in one go, what's not to like? So this is really one of my favorite ones. But I also really love solar, rooftop solar, especially if you're a homeowner, of course, and if you're planning to stay in your home for a few years, then solar in many cases is an absolute win-win situation and a no-brainer, because not only do you reduce your emissions because you're now generating a lot of your own electricity with the sun, but you're also reducing your power bills. And usually installing solar saves on your power bill between 50 and 60%. And again, we've tried to make it really easy because it is a confusing area, and some people are suspicious of installers and don't know who to trust. So we've tried to find a very good, reliable local company and have partnered with them, that is Solar Pro. And again, it's just to make it easy. You can get a quote from Solar Pro, but of course you're also welcome to get quotes from other companies and do your own comparison. But at least we wanted to give people a starting point where they can go for a trustworthy local company. And the same as with Diamond Energy, Solar Pro contributes to our community giving fund. And we've just had our first community solar installation in June, where we installed a 13 kilowatt system for the local Pioneer Clubhouse, a mental health not-for-profit. And this was thanks to our collaboration with Solar Pro. So it's an easy way to make a real difference. Those two things, switching your power company and installing solar if you can.
It's such fantastic work that you do, and I really love that you are reducing all of the obstacles for people to reduce their emissions. You're taking all of the thought out of it. So thank you so much. And if we just go back to that graph, you're looking at electricity, and then you're going to talk next about maybe some transport, how we can reduce that 30% of the emissions.
So transport, the obvious one would be to just be really active and walk and cycle. And I know the Northern Beaches Council also has a cycling strategy in place, and it's having a bit of a boom during COVID times, which is great. Obviously, public transport is another really good way to get around, but I think we're not kidding ourselves. We're quite reliant on the car on the Northern Beaches. So the question is, what can you do if active transport or public transport is not an option? And one relative newcomer are electric bikes. We've put together a guide on how to buy an electric guide on our website, and we've also listed the local providers, the local sellers, and it's a lot of fun. I've only borrowed an electric bike a couple of times. I live at the top of a hill, which for a normal bike is really a killer, but with the electric bike, it's just a beauty. And people who've bought one, they say it's really changed their mobility, and there's so much more they can do, and so many occasions when they just leave the car at home now. Now, if you've got a family or do a big shop, that's not always an option. And then the other thing of the future is electric vehicles. You know, this is definitely where we are going, and it's just about accelerating that transition. For many people, an electric car at the moment is not within their budget. You know, I think there's hardly anyone who wouldn't love a Tesla, but that is, of course, very pricey still. So at Zero Emissions, we've try to find an alternative and offer an entryway to electric vehicles. And we are cooperating with a social enterprise in Tasmania called the Good Car Company. The Good Car Company imports secondhand electric vehicles, mostly Nissan Leafs, into Australia and makes sure they're fit for purpose in Australia. And the price point is really amazing. It starts from $20,000 for a secondhand EV, which compared to a Tesla, which is, you know, mid 60, 70,000, is a huge difference. And I know there's some other EV options in between but you know, you won't find a new EV for $20,000. So the Good Car Company is offering a real alternative if you have that kind of budget. On our website, we've got a couple of links on electric cars in general, but also a direct link to the Good Car Company and their buy now list. They also offer community bulk buys, which we are looking at for the Northern Beaches, but that might take a while. So in the meantime, you can just approach them and see what they're offering right now and what they're selling at the moment. Okay. So the last one, which wasn't on the pie chart, surprisingly, is money. And Nigel already hinted at it a couple of times. Money, you know, makes the world go round. We know that it's behind any decision we make, any purchasing decision, any funding decision. And the crazy thing is that less than 8% of our superannuation could fund Australia's transition to 100% renewable energy by 2030. So it really matters where we invest our money, where we put our super. And with Zero Emissions, we're not a financial advisor, but we put together some starting information, again, to make it easy for people. If they're looking at their superannuation, and chances are, if you are with one of the big banks, with one of the big funds, your super fund is not the most ethical, not as sustainable as it can be. But there's some very good alternatives also offering very good returns. So that myth that you're taking a financial hit by switching to a sustainable superannuation fund is simply not true. And yes, we are really encouraging people to switch to super. And another myth is that it is very complicated, that it takes forever. To fill out a form to switch your super doesn't take long. That takes 10 to 15 minutes. And of course, you want to do a bit of research, but that could be a project for a rainy afternoon to really sit down and go through a few options and make your decision. And with that, you will have an amazing big impact. And this is the trend of investing. This is where the returns are going to be in the future, because our future has to be sustainable, whether we're forced to by outside forces like European carbon tariffs or whether our own government makes the change. So it's a really, if not the most important change we can all make.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And Charlotte, that's a really key message. And if there are people in our Northern Beaches community that are watching this video right now, I feel like one of the first steps that they could do is to look at their superannuation statements this weekend and jump onto the Zero Emissions Sydney North website and go to that link. And when you're there, can you compare the performances of some of the superannuation funds? How does your service take away some of the complication of that? Can you explain?
With our money program is at the moment, it's just a collation of information, and because it's a tricky field in terms of financial advice, we don't offer more than the basics, but we give people very good starting points. And there are other fantastic organizations like Market Forces where you can go for more research, and you can check out, we are listing 2 superannuation funds, which we believe are very good. And you can go to those 2 and check those out and compare their performances and then make your own decisions. If you do have a financial planner, you can also ask them for advice. So our page is meant to be a starting point.
Fantastic. And so critical to have that information. So thank you. So for any people in Northern Beaches that are out there, definitely take some time during lockdown to have a look at your superannuation, to review that, to just double check your energy and make sure that you have a zero emissions provider. And if not, then reach out to Zero Emissions Sydney North, and they can help you review if solar is right for you and what your options are about reducing that biggest proportion of your emissions from your household. And yes, please do keep us updated about the bulk buy of electric vehicles. And Charlotte, I'm sure that there are so many people that are really interested, and we've been researching that as well. And it's really exciting because those cars are here and they are available, and it just takes the time to go through the process. And it's wonderful that an organisation like Zero Emissions Sydney North has people like you that are working so hard to help individual people change their behaviour so that it has a huge impact. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And then one last thing. So at Zero Emissions, we're focusing on things, the switch programs and investments like solar. But I also did want to mention what Nigel said as well, that there are also some very easy behavioral changes that will have a big impact, like simply buying less stuff. Yes. Flying less, rethinking your holiday, rethinking your work once we can fly again, rethinking whether you need that trip to Melbourne or can you do it via Zoom. We're so good on Zoom now, there's no reason not to keep some of the silver linings from COVID. And then last not least, look at your diet and try to slowly phase out beef, especially because that has the impact through the methane. And introduce more vegetarian dishes into your diet. It doesn't have to happen overnight. And, with my family, I'm still on a transition and we have maybe 3 to 4 vegetarian meals a week, but we're getting there. So it's all about getting started and doing the first few actions.
And Nigel, if you could give advice to the residents of the Northern Beaches, if they had only 2 hours each week to devote to something that's going to reduce that carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, what would you recommend that they do with those 2 hours?
And Charlotte's covered such a great list of things that we can do in our lives already. But if they had just 2 hours a week, then the first thing I'd say is they can write 1 email a week, keeping climate emergency pressure on our politicians, on Jason Falinski, James Griffin, Brad Hazard, Rob Stokes, Michael Regan, and all our ward councillors. They need to hear from the community, let them know that we really care about a survivable future for our kids and grandkids, and we expect them to act. We're not asking them, we're telling them it's time for them to step up and do the things that we need them to do. Don't expect a reply, but keep writing. That's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing, with just 2 hours a week, I'd say become a keyboard climate warrior. Get on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, read about this stuff, learn about this stuff, tell everybody, have conversations with your friends and neighbors, and just in 2 hours a week, you can really make stuff happen.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nigel. The other thing that I think is really important to mention, because I can see that people come in their waste journey at a lot of different stages and complexities, is putting the pressure on businesses, because businesses need to know when they're sitting making decisions at the boardroom table, they need to know that there's enough pressure from people who are their potential customers that they want to have materials that are produced in a sustainable way, and that the packaging is going to be perfectly compostable, and that there is sort of an end of life cycle accountability process, so that material that it's actually getting made can be put back into the circular economy. So you guys have got it. It's the government pressure, business pressure, and doing as many actions as you possibly can that have the most impact on reducing those emissions, and talking about it with your friends. It's got to be fun and it's got to be easy. So I really appreciate everything that you guys are doing, and together we can do this. Let's just keep up the conversation.
Thank you, Jolene. And I think just adding on to the friends, but I think it's really, this is one of the most important things, just influencing your own network. And, you know, most people don't really like to be lectured to, but they watch you, they see what you're doing. And specifically for solar, we've even got scientific proof that solar tends to grow in hubs. You know, one person installs it in their street, the neighbors see it, they start talking about it. Before you know it, you've got several houses in the street, all with solar. And so it's wonderful to see this positive contagion, and you know, good things can spread as well. So yeah, we can all just make a difference in our own little world, and all of us together will have a great impact. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when we hear, you know, read the latest IPCC report and hear all the devastating news. Sometimes it's easy to just think you give up, but I think we all have the power as consumers, the power as influencers, and if enough of us act, we can make a difference.
We mustn't give up. We mustn't give up.
Thank you guys so much. Good things can be contagious. Let's do it.
Thanks, Jolene.